Recently, our lessons have been about a lot of terrible things that, over time, in the long run, in some cases, had some pretty good effects, especially for Europe. We've talked about the brutal conquests of the Mongols that ended up reestablishing the Silk Roads and bringing trade all the way from the East in China to European shores for the first time in years. We've seen the Crusades, a series of brutal wars, um, none of which were successful or justified, really, that ended up in the long run bringing the world of Arab knowledge to Europe and um, making Europeans especially interested in trade, particularly in the Indian Ocean region. And we saw the Black Death, a horrible disease that, killed a bunch of people, but then made the world slightly more pleasant or more friendly for the people who survived. So today we're going to put that all together and look at Europe's unlikely recovery, how long-term effects of the Black Death and the Crusades ended up bringing the feudal system and the Middle Ages, the time period generally with it, to an end. This is great news for Europe and not so great news for the natives of the Americas who are about to be colonized in the next chunk of history. But now we're going to be looking at that story of European recovery. So as a reminder, the post-classical period, the Middle Ages, however you want to call it, it began when the Roman Empire fell, and it spanned about 1,000 years, ending roughly around Columbus's voyage to the Americas. So we're going to look at how this society that at first struggled just to survive ended up able and willing to set out on long ocean-bound voyages. As a reminder, the feudal system that really was both a blessing and a curse for Europe. It made Europeans able to survive the transition after the fall of Rome by providing for people's basic necessities. But also it kept Europe in a rut because it was a system that wasn't designed for a lot of progress or social mobility. Right? So it was based on trading land for loyalty and services, with the whole economy based on land ownership instead of money. It was a pretty decent way to establish order in a time of chaos and to make sure that most people's basic survival needs were met. But without money in circulation, there was no social mobility. It also depended on a huge mass of peasant labor, people at the very bottom of the hierarchy, to produce enough food for everybody else. It was a system of weak governments. The king was the head of state, but he had to borrow knights from nobles if he wanted to fight. He was also limited in his ability to collect tax money because the economy was based on land. It was also a system that gave the Catholic Church incredible influence, not only over the government, over king, but it was basically unquestioned amongst the population. People tried to live their life in order to make it to heaven when they died, and that's where they saw hope for a better life. People didn't really try to improve the way that they were living in the here and now. It also fostered an isolated, intolerant culture that therefore experienced little cultural diffusion. Most Europeans didn't go very far away from when they were born. Most people from faraway lands didn't come into Europe to trade long distance because it wasn't safe and Europe was poor anyway. And so you had like very few ideas penetrating this kind of bubble that could pull Europe into a better place. And then two horrible things happened that in the long run ended up being good. The Crusades, a string of wars that Europe lost over and over and over again, and the Black Death, a disease that killed somewhere around 40% of Europeans, ended up leading to the revival of Europe. And our job for today is to answer the question of how. We're going to start with the story of the Crusades, and I'm going to take this opportunity to read from you a chapter of one of my favorite history books called A Little History of the World. It was written by the historian E.H. Gombrich in order to be a history of the world that he could read to his granddaughter as a bedtime story. And I really just kind of like that whole idea. So we're going to review the Crusades through a chapter of this book that I will just read to you. I usually assign it for homework, but you guys are getting out of that. And as I'm reading, listen for effects of the Crusades that could be good for Europe. And if you're an extra good student, maybe keep a list. As you know, a medieval knight's first duty was to fight for God and for Christendom, or so they believed. And it wasn't long before they found an opportunity to do so. Christ's tomb in Jerusalem was, as was the whole of Palestine, in the hands of Arab unbelievers, quote unquote. So, when reminded of their duty to help and liberate the tomb by the Pope, Christian knights, in their tens of thousands, cried out enthusiastically, "It is God's will." A great army set off. In 1096, first to Constantinople and then on through Asia Minor, that's what we would call Turkey nowadays, towards Palestine. These knights and their followers had crosses of red material stitched to their shoulders and were called crusaders. Their aim was to liberate the land in which Christ's cross had once stood. Once inside Jerusalem, however, they behaved neither like knights nor like Christians. They massacred all the Muslims and committed hideous atrocities. The Crusaders founded the Christian kingdom of Jerusalem, but because it was small and weak and far from Europe and in the midst of Muslim kingdoms, the little state was forever under attack from Arab warriors. This meant that, back in England, France, and Germany, priests were forever urging knights to go on new crusades. Not all of these crusades were successful. However, one good thing came from all the crusades, although it wouldn't have pleased the knights at all. In the distant Orient, the East, the Christians discovered Arab culture, their buildings, their sense of beauty, and their learning. And within 100 years of the First Crusade, the writings of Alexander the Great's teacher, the books of Aristotle, a Greek rationalist philosopher, were translated from Arabic into Latin and eagerly read and studied in Italy, France, Germany, and England. All that the Arabs had learnt and experienced in the course of their conquests around the world was now brought back to Europe by the Crusaders. In a number of ways, it was the example of those they looked on as their enemies that transformed the barbaric warriors of Europe into truly chivalrous knights. As another unintended effect of the Crusades, contact with the Arab civilization opened Europeans' eyes to the goods and wealth that could be had on the Indian Ocean trade routes. Europeans came back from the Crusades with tales of goods, spices, and technology, prompting Europeans to begin to want to explore, to find a new way to get to the Indian Ocean trade routes without having to cross Arab land. This renewed interest in trade would bring money back to Europe, revitalizing cities, and changing the basis of the economy from land to money. It will also lead a certain Christopher Columbus off to sail the ocean blue in 1492. In the course of the 100 years that passed between 1190 and 1291, Europe changed in more ways than is possible to imagine. In the early Middle Ages, most of Western Europe was composed of kingdoms, states, that were largely lands of knights, monks, and peasants. But over the following 100 years, the situation in Western Europe changed beyond recognition. Many eastward crusades had already taken Germans far from home, and they had established trading relationships in distant countries. They no longer exchanged oxen for sheep or drinking horns for cloth, because they too were using money. And where there was money, there were markets, where all sorts of goods could be bought. These markets could not be held just anywhere. They had to be in fixed places, protected by walls and towers, usually near a castle. Anyone who set up a stall in one and traded, as a burgher, was no longer bound in serfdom to a landowner. A burgher was somebody who lived in a town. So that sentence is saying that if you became a trader and you sold stuff in town, you no longer had to work as a peasant. People like to say the city air brings freedom, because burghers in the biggest towns answer to no one but the king. But you mustn't imagine that life in a town in the Middle Ages was anything like it is today. Most towns were small, crooked mazes of tiny alleys, narrow houses with high, pointed gables. Merchants and craftsmen lived there with their families, crowded together in little space. But like the Crusaders who in the name of piety had carried out that dreadful massacre in Jerusalem, there were many citizens who learned to hate all those who didn't share their faith. Jews, above all, were their targets, and the more pious they felt themselves to be, the more they abused them. Forbidden to own fields, they couldn't be peasants, let alone become knights. Nor were they allowed to practice any craft. The only occupation open to them was trade, so that is what they did. Even then, they were only permitted to live in specific parts of the town and only able to wear certain clothes. Yet, in time, some of them were able to earn a lot of money, which knights and townspeople borrowed and were often unable to repay. This only made the Jews more hated, and they were repeatedly attacked and robbed. Having neither the power nor the right to defend themselves, they were helpless. Bad enough to be a Jew, but worse still if you were someone who, after having pored long over the Bible, began to doubt some aspect of its teaching. Such people were called heretics, and the persecutions they suffered were terrible. Anyone perceived to be a heretic was publicly burned alive. Whole cities were razed to combat heresy, and entire regions laid to waste. Crusades were waged against them, just as they were against Muslims. And all this was done by the very people who, for the God of mercy, were building magnificent cathedrals, buildings which, with their soaring towers and great decorated porches, with their stained glass windows gleaming like jewels in the darkness and their thousands of statues, seemed to offer a glorious vision of the kingdom of heaven. And yet, the 1300s was also a time of unimaginable brilliance and excitement, a time when towns were expanding, and proud knights no longer sat in grim seclusion in their lonely strongholds, but chose instead to inhabit the courts of rich and powerful kings and princes. In Flanders and Brabant, now Belgium, but above all in Italy, life was truly magnificent. Here there were prosperous towns trading in precious cloth such as silk and brocades, and offering every conceivable comfort and luxury. Knights and noblemen feasted at court in splendid, richly embroidered robes. By now, reading and writing was common in towns. It was a necessity for tradesmen and artisans, and many knights liked to address artful and elegant poems to their elegant ladies. Nor was knowledge any longer the preserve of a handful of monks in their cells. Soon after 1200, students from countries far and wide were flocking in the thousands to famous University of Paris, where they studied and argued a great deal over the opinions of Aristotle, the Greek rationalist philosopher, and how these might or might not agree with what was written in the Bible. From here on out, rulers no longer lived in lonely fortresses in the countryside, nor did they set out across the world only on adventurous military campaigns. Their castles were built in the centers of towns. This alone tells you how important towns had become, but it was only the beginning. Okay, so that's the end of the chapter, and on this slide you have a list of many potential effects of the Crusades that you may have written down. So go ahead and pause the video here and check your notes against this list. It looked like things were looking up in Europe after the Crusades, and then, of course, plague struck, decimating the population in medieval Europe, as the chart shows on the slide. We've seen in previous classes, though, that with this tremendous and dramatic and horrible loss of life came some weird, unexpected benefits for the people who survived, especially for workers. Workers could start to ask for money for their services instead of just being paid with the right to live on a plot of land. Because so many peasants had died, the surviving peasants' lives improved. So social mobility became possible again. That means it was possible to move up in class. It was possible to hope for a better life in this life. You didn't have to wait and die to go to heaven anymore. So, to summarize, the Crusades and the Plague had some pretty important effects on the feudal system. Both of them led to more movement, migration, and the rebirth of long-distance trade and the cultural diffusion that comes with it. As cities became more prosperous because of trade, as wealth developed in cities, they became more important, and so more of life became focused on cities. This helped create something of a middle class of craftsmen, artisans, people who make things to trade, and merchants, people who sell things for a living. And the economy was no longer based on land, but instead was based on goods or money. The Crusades and the Black Death also had pretty important effects on the church and the way power worked. First, kings were able to ask for taxes to support the Crusades, which boosted their power. Second, since the church was unable to support people during the plague, in other words, nobody from the church could stop the disease, slowly and subtly, but surely, people began to chip away at their absolute faith in the church's ability to know the truth of everything. People began to question the church's power a little bit. So third, political power in Europe, slowly but surely, began to shift from the Pope to kings. As we saw in the last class, effects of the plague were a bit more complicated than that. They affected not just the way that people could live, not just relative power of church and king, but also the way people thought about their life, about the risks they were willing to take. And if you'd like a refresher, feel free to pause the slide here and refresh your memory on the multiple effects of the plague. And now we get to the key points, but don't start writing yet, because there are two ways to take notes for today's lesson. Today's lesson involved multiple causes and effects, a really complicated process that over time ended a whole time period and established the conditions where the revival of Europe, the Renaissance, could take place. You can take notes on complicated cause and effect a couple different ways. If you're a person who tends to think in terms of like text and tables, option number 1 is on the board for you now. You can pause the slide and copy the table, which takes you through from the far left column what European society had been like during the Dark Ages under feudal Europe, to the middle column, what changed by the end of the Middle Ages, and in the far right column, the causes of those change. Focusing on the middle column, I'll just talk you through the big important changes. First, cities and towns began to emerge. People don't all live in the countryside. Second, money is back in circulation, and that means, third, social mobility is possible again. Fourth, because there's more money in circulation and therefore more tax ability to collect, government is ruled by stronger kings who can begin to pay for their own armies. The church remains powerful. People are still very Catholic, but slightly less so. They don't have like the iron grip on people's full hopes and beliefs and lives that they did before. And finally, super importantly, literacy is back. People are slowly but surely able to read and write again, and they have more to read. They've rediscovered the ancient Greek wisdom of the rationalists that can really boost society to progress. When you have an entire society that can't read and write, you have a society that can't transmit knowledge effectively from generation to generation or from place to place. But now that reading and writing is back, Europeans can begin to do that again. So this is the text-heavy version of the key points. But if you are more of a visual thinker, you might prefer to make a concept map. Concept mapping is tricky. It takes a lot of practice in order to like become good at it. And my first drafts are never cute or pretty, so be prepared for that. But if you want to keep track of cause and effect, this is one of the best ways to take notes. I'm going to show you how to do it, and then I'm going to put the slide back so that you can copy it into your notes as an example if you would like to. The purpose of concept mapping is to explain how multiple causes lead to multiple effects. It's really good in terms of not just showing what cause leads to what effect, but if you're really disciplined about explaining how each cause leads to each effect, then you can set yourself up to have a really clear understanding of complicated events, and that leads to really great writing as well. In order to make concept maps, You take your initial cause, like the Crusades in this instance, and put it in a box. You take an effect of that cause and put it in a separate box, and you connect the two with an arrow, like so. If you'd like to add detail, and I usually do like a description or a characteristic of anything in a box, I connect those with just a straight line. But cause to effect goes with an arrow. And for the clearest concept map ever, it helps to have a brief explanation of how a cause leads to that effect over the arrow. For example, we can start with the cause, the Crusades, and we're looking to explain eventually how it ends the feudal system. But there are lots of causes and effects between those steps, right? If I wanted to just jot a note of what the Crusades were, I have that here in a box connected with the line. And if we wanted to take a pretty important effect of the Crusades, like trade starts again, I would put that in this box, like so, with a brief explanation of why trade starts again. So contact with the Arab Empire leads to cultural diffusion and technology. So Europeans start trading again. And then that is also a cause of a different effect, right? So like new ideas are brought to Europe, like gunpowder, paper technology. But also the Black Death spreads to Europe. Why did it spread? Because rats carry plague on trading ships. So, as a concept map, here are all of the causes and effects that take us from the Crusades and the Black Death to end the feudal system and generally the post-classical period in history. So go ahead and pause this slide here, copy this into your notes, and you are done.